Will you help us?
What seems to be the problem?
Death.
I want more life. An experiment, nothing more.
Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is a famed science fiction novel by Philip K. Dick, one of the masters of the genre. After many years, that novel was adapted into a screenplay by David Peoples and Hampton Fancher, although it was a rocky and uncertain road just to get to that point, with several versions of the script, different directors being interested in developing it, and of course, budget talks. Producer Michael Dealey finally approved the script for this movie and then approached director Ridley Scott to direct it. Ridley came aboard the project and wanted some changes, altering the pace and the themes of the script primarily. On top of that, another script based on Alan E. Norse's novel, The Blade Runner, came to their attention, and Ridley really liked the title, so they bought it. They managed to get a lot of money to fund it, and then Philip K. Dick found out about the movie, and he was not happy. He didn't like the original script. After seeing the new script, as well as some special effects test footage, the early 20 minutes of the movie, his concerns were levied a little. He then sadly passed away before the movie was finished and released in 1982. That movie was, of course, Blade Runner. The science fiction classic, some would call it a masterpiece, although upon release its reception was mixed to negative, and it didn't exactly perform well either. More on that later though. There's a long, storied history about this movie, some of which I've already regaled with you with. But there's a lot of cool, interesting information about the movie you might not have known about. So here we go, 10 cool facts about Blade Runner. Rutger Hauer, who plays the villainous replicant Roy Batty, was cast in Blade Runner without ever having met director Ridley Scott before. He didn't even have to audition. After watching some of Rutger's prior films, Ridley was so impressed by his performances that he cast him immediately, right there and then. However, eventually the two of them did have to meet, and Rutger thought playing a joke on Ridley Scott would be a great icebreaker of sorts. So he turned up for their meeting wearing large green sunglasses, pink satin pants, and a white sweater with an image of a fox on the front. Quite outlandish, and hardly the most stylish of outfits, although I'm not one to judge on that front. Catherine Haber, the production executive, claims that Ridley Scott literally turned white at the sight of Rutger. Regardless of this first impression, Rutger was still cast in the role. Philip K. Dick's novel, which this film is based on, has quite a few differences from the actual movie. One of which is the term replicant, which isn't mentioned or said once in the book. In the book, what we know as replicants are instead called androids or Andes. The writers of the film felt the term android or Andes would come across as funny or cheesy. I think they got this one wrong personally, but oh well. They sought out an alternative. Writer David Webb Peoples' daughter was studying microbiology and biochemistry at the time. She introduced her father to the theory of replication, which we all know is the process whereby cells are duplicated for cloning purposes. Keep up. And David liked it so much he called the androids replicants. There's an iconic moment in this film in which actress Joanna Cassidy crashes through a sheet of glass. Due to budget and time restraints, they had to do this scene fast and at the end of the production. The problem with having limited time and money is that sometimes mistakes are made, and you end up having to just live with them. The big mistake is that it's clearly not Joanna Cassidy crashing through the glass, but instead her stunt woman Lee Pulford, wearing a very bad wig that just happened to be on hand that day. This ended up in the original cut of the movie because they had no other choice basically. However, When Ridley Scott got the opportunity to make the final cut of the movie, they went and shot a new version of this scene 25 years after it was originally shot. This has since been referred to as the green screen shoot, and has also since been done on dozens of other films since. In this new footage, Joanna Cassidy donned the costume once again, surprised that it still fit her, and then she reshot the scene. The footage of Lee Pulford, the stuntwoman, was then digitally altered by having her face replaced by Joanna's. There's a scene in the movie in which Daryl Hannah's character attacks Rick Deckard using gymnastics and some very impressive moves. Of course, it wasn't Daryl Hannah doing the scene, nor was it her stunt double. A female gymnast was hired to double for Daryl Hannah and perform the flexible stunt work. But Ridley Scott rehearsed the scene so many times that when they were finally ready to put it onto film, the stunt woman was just too exhausted to do it in a safe manner. So, in a bit of a panic, while on their lunch break, the crew managed to find and recruit a male gymnast to do the scene instead. There are several cuts of Blade Runner. Notably, one of the earlier cuts had a Hollywood noir style voiceover running over the film, with Harrison Ford's dulcet tones adding mood and description to everything that was happening, and I mean everything. Harrison Ford has said that what he remembers most about making Blade Runner was not the grueling shoot or the arguments with Ridley Scott, but instead being forced to record the voiceover for the film that the executive producers insisted be there. He says, and I quote, "It was written by clowns." Daryl Honnickson was the apparent clown who wrote the voiceover, but this version of the script was thrown aside. Roland Kibbe was then hired to rewrite it, and it was his voiceover dialogue that was recorded. David Webb Peoples and Hampton Fancher, the official screenwriters of the film, wrote voiceovers for the script, but what they wrote wasn't used in the film because the producers wanted expository monologues and not what they had written. When the writers first saw the theatrical cut of the film, they both hated it, and they believed it was one of them that was responsible for the voiceovers. Because they were trying to be all nice and friendly, they told one another they loved it, not finding out they were both not to blame for it until much later. Ridley Scott and the crew liked the initial cut of the film the director wanted, but feared it was just too long, at 4 hours. Editing and voiceover was seen as a way of cutting things down and focusing the story. Ridley wanted the voiceover to complement the mood of the scenes, but instead the voiceover over-explained everything. This version has since been thought to be lost to time. In 1989, a sound preservationist known as Michael Arick stumbled upon a 70mm print of the film. A few months later, a Cineplex Odeon Fairfax Theatre was having a classic film festival featuring 70mm prints, so Arick sent over the print he discovered. However, nobody had actually watched this newly discovered print. They just assumed it was the international cut of the film. To their surprise, it was a completely different cut of the film. They screened it some more, and the film was selling out. Warner Bros. Proposed to Ridley Scott that they call it the director's cut and re-release the movie, but Scott refused, claiming it was not his cut of the movie and it would need several changes before he would commit to such a thing. Scott and Arick were not given enough time to do these cuts and changes, so the final result was not Scott's preferred version of the film. In 2007, Scott was finally able to release the final definitive cut of Blade Runner, labelled the Final Cut. At the time of filming, an actors' strike was on the horizon. This meant that the shooting schedule became very long and rushed to complete the movie before the strike took place. Adding to the complications, two of Rutger Hauer's stunt doubles were injured filming the movie's finale. Rutger asked for the gap that needed to be jumped by the stunt doubles to be tightened, and then he went and filmed it himself. After 25 hours of non-stop shooting, Rutger then had to film his climactic death scene. So exhausted he was that he asked to be excused, at which point he went to his hotel and he just collapsed. He returned the next day after some sleep, and the looming actor strike had been averted. Hauer then finished his final scenes and even came up with his famous monologue all by himself. Ridley Scott is British. He's actually from the same city I'm from, or nearabouts, but this was an American movie. That meant that due to American Union rules, Scott could not bring his own British crew over with him, and the strict codes and rules of American filmmaking prevented him from operating a camera himself, something he always does. Adding to his frustrations, he kept being questioned by crew members, financiers, and producers alike. It wasn't just Scott who was having a hard time, because the crew also disliked working for him, or on this film. They considered him cold, distant, and a perfectionist, things that resulted in extremely long shoots. The result was that members of the crew were constantly leaving the production or just being fired. Call sheets in the morning were often the only way of finding out if you still had a job working with or for Ridley Scott. In the British press, Scott made a casual comment claiming he preferred working with English crews because when he asked for something, they would say yes governor and get to work. The makeup supervisor, Marvin G. Westmore, saw this and was disgusted. Bit of overselling it, but alright. He retaliated by printing t-shirts that said, "Yes governor, my ass" on the front. Scott was mildly amused by this, and some of his closer collaborators made their own shirts that said, "Xenophobia sucks," and Scott himself got a cap that read, "Gov." Scott later said it was a joke, that he hoped people would be confused by the word xenophobia and would ask what it meant. Regardless, this whole TV shirt rivalry did break the ice and bring people together. Sort of. The writers did not have Harrison Ford in mind when working on the script. In fact, they imagined Robert Mitchum in the lead role of Rick Deckard, who, if you didn't know, was a star back in the 50s and 60s, and therefore would have been a significantly older choice for the role by the time they started making the film in the 80s. They also thought about Christopher Walken and Tommy Lee Jones. When Ridley Scott came aboard, he wanted Dustin Hoffman in the role, but Dustin Hoffman turned it down because of a difference of opinions with Scott. Ridley, always making friends he is. He did however say that, "I figured, unlikely though he may be in terms of his physical size as a sci-fi hero, as an actor, Hoffman could do anything," explains Scott. Therefore, it really didn't matter. It has since come out that Hoffman wanted to tweak the character a little too much, reducing how macho he was, and some claim he asked for too much money too. In the end, Harrison Ford was cast in the role, hoping to stretch his dramatic chops and branch out from his leading roles in Star Wars and Indiana Jones. Blade Runner was released to a mixed reception and it flopped at the box office. In time, thanks to new cuts and re-releases, it did make its money back and the critical reception has increased too. It even got a long awaited and in my opinion a far better sequel as well. But the film itself was not the only thing to suffer after its release. And unlike the film, those that did suffer didn't always recuperate. The film was said to have been cursed. In the film, several logos and brands and businesses can be seen, including Atari, Pan Am, RCA, Cuisinart, and Bell Phones. These businesses all went on to suffer severe problems after the film released. Coca-Cola was also featured in the film, and in 1985 their new Coke experiment proved to be a big failure. But they stuck around, I think. Members of the crew have since referred to this as the product placement Blade Runner curse. Not the smartest title ever, but I suppose they weren't the writers.